Yeah, we are live. It's 7:05, just a couple minutes late. That's okay. Tonight we're talking about turbos as usual, and it's time to talk about why turbos make such good daily driver stuff, why turbo combinations and daily drivers are such good combinations. And we're going to get into that a little bit because I'm working on a video right now on daily drivers and that kind of build up Ford, Chevy, and Dodge kind of the mild combinations. A lot of times when I do these videos, we do stuff where we're making lots and lots of power and all that's well and good. But, for the things that we would drive around, we still want a little bit of performance, but we don't, we make that combination different than we make obviously some sort of drag strip combination or some race combination. And so the thing is that all the things that went into, and I was looking at this today, all the things that went into making the combinations that I'm going to put in the video that will be putting up later tonight or tomorrow, all the things that go into making those daily drivers work so well actually work very well as turbo combinations as well. So we're going to get into a little bit about what some of the common myths are with these turbo and especially camshafts. There's still so much misinformation about camshafts that guys don't realize. And the biggest one of the things is that people still think turbo camshafts are a thing. And I know when I say that there are cam manufacturers that, that they make turbo specific camshafts and that works. And I'm not saying that turbo camshafts aren't a thing. What I'm saying is the problem is that it tends, I'm going to try to change the lighting here just a little bit and see what happens. What tends to happen though is that when we tell people that, hey, you have a turbocharged combination, you need a turbo camshaft. When we tell people that, the problem is that they think they need something very specific. And especially when people start talking about, and there's really knowledgeable guys perpetuating this, unfortunately, really sharp guys, really legendary big guys that are out there. And the common misconception has been going on in the industry for a long, long time. And that's that, let's see if I can adjust this just a little bit here. There we go. And that's the common misconception about turbo stuff is that boost, you don't want lots of overlap in a camshaft because you don't want those radical cams that make power because that, and here's the discussion we need to have, that lets all of the boost, because we know that on one side when we have a turbo creating boost, it fills up the intake tract basically with boost behind the valve. When the valve opens, all that wonderful boosty goodness goes into the motor, right? But, and let's talk about this a little bit, there's a period of time when both the intake and the exhaust valve are both open. This is called overlap, and this is a critical thing in cam designing. So this overlap period is a time when the intake valve is open and the exhaust valve is open. And the concern for everybody with camshaft design with respect to turbocharging is that when those two are open, it allows all that boosted goodness to go through into the open intake valve and then out the open exhaust valve. And there are a number of things that we need to talk about this. First of all, this period of time, relatively speaking, in the 4-cycle track that happens with your typical internal combustion engine, when this happens, this period of time where both of the valves are open is a very, very tiny relative to when they're all closed. So the period of time that those two are both simultaneously open enough for this kind of thing to possibly happen, very, very short period of time. Then that period of time becomes even shorter. And the reason for that is if you multiply it out and you do the math on how much time either one of those valves spend open in real time, like if you take something that a motor that's running at 6,000 revolutions per minute, if you divide that by 60, because that tells you how many times it's happening a second, that's 100 times a second. So the valves are open and closing. Let's say that the cam is doing half of the speed that the engine is. Even that's 50 times a second. So that's how fast that valve is opening and closing. So like I said, and during the time that the valve is opening and closing, there's only overlap for an even shorter percentage of that total time. So the amount of time that both of the valves are open when this, boost leak could actually happen is very, very tiny. So all the stuff has to like hurry up and get out of there, and it really can't. It's very difficult for it to do. And I'll tell you why, even more so than the time element that we're talking about, why it's almost impossible for that to happen anyway. As most people know, and if you've been watching this channel a lot, you hopefully should know, and the video that I just posted up, the last one, demonstrated this perfectly. Very rarely do we have an instance where, because with a turbo application, the hot side of the turbo, the turbine side, is spun with hot exhaust gases. There is pressure in there spinning that because there's resistance for that. There's resistance for that flow. So we have a buildup of what's called back pressure. So we have back pressure inherent in any turbo system. 9 times out of 10, and it's probably more like 9.5 times out of 10, there's going to be more back pressure than boost pressure. One thing that we know, and on rare occasions, you'll have the same amount of boost pressure and back pressure. And we saw that running a big turbo on the 4.8 liter. And you can have that also on smaller displacement motors, 1.5s, 1.6 liters, 2 liters, small displacement 4 cylinders with a good sized turbo on it that are trying to make lots of power. It's not uncommon for you to have less back pressure than boost pressure. My Bonneville motor that I built, that we set the land speed records with in the Honda Civic, had less back pressure than boost pressure. That's kind of a rare occurrence. But it is certainly possible. But the vast majority, any sort of production motor, production turbo deal, like I said, 9 times out of 10, you're going to have more back pressure than you have boost pressure. So one thing that we know about the way that the universe is if you have lots of pressure over here and less pressure over here, and you have a connection between those two, the more pressure side is going to flow towards the less pressure side. Nature abhors a vacuum. And so what will happen is they will seek stasis. So they will want to be the same pressure. So if one's high pressure and one's low pressure, the high pressure is going to flow toward the low pressure. So we have all this boost, right, flowing out into the exhaust, except that the exhaust has higher pressure. So if any of those things were to happen on a turbo application with a cam that has the dreaded overlap in it, what would happen actually in most instances is the back pressure would be more likely to flow toward the boost pressure because it's lower during this overlap period of time. But again, that usually does not happen. There's not enough time for that to happen. And actually having overlap in your camshaft is good for power production. And the one thing I can say is that, and this is something that a lot of cam designers don't do, is they don't test it. They design a camshaft based on valve events on their computer and put it in a combination with a 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 horsepower turbo or turbos, whatever they're doing. And it makes, not surprisingly, 1,000, 1,500 or 2,000 horsepower because of the turbo. And they declare it a success. What they don't tell you is they tell you how great they are because they've made all of this power with their turbo specific camshaft. What they don't tell you is that they never tested any other camshaft on that combination. And they also don't tell you that lots of other cams with different specs than they used would have also made that 1,000 horsepower, 1,500 or 2,000 horsepower. Now, when you get up in very, very high levels of stuff, there are specific cams that are going to be better than others, and all that's going to work. For 99% of us, certainly 95% of us, for the 1,000 horsepower and probably more than that and less, almost any cam that you grab will be able to do that. And what a lot of the cam designers don't realize is, and what they haven't done is done any testing. So what they've done is they develop a turbo cam and they run the turbo cam and they go, look, it works. Yes, it worked because you added a turbo to a motor. It wouldn't make any difference what cam that motor had. It wouldn't make any difference. Whatever power output that motor makes, whether it's a stock cam or a truck cam or a torque cam or stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 17, whatever power output that naturally aspirated combination makes, when we add boost to it, it's just going to multiply that. It's going to, if you add 10 pounds of boost to whatever curve that is, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize, forget about the camshaft. Look at the power curve. Whatever that power curve is, if you add 10 pounds everywhere, the curve is going to be exactly the same. The only thing that's going to happen is all the numbers are going to be bigger. Effectively, what you've done, if you look at a typical dyno curve, it has numbers over here and has RPM here. And then all that would have to happen for you to figure out what the turbo combination is going to do is if you make these numbers higher, because that's all that happens. The curve is the same. So if you run a little torque cam and it makes peak power at 5,800 RPM and you add 10 pounds of boost to that, it's going to be that plus 10 pounds. That's what happens. You don't need to put the turbo specific camshaft in there for it to work with the turbo. The turbo works with the stock cam. It works with a torque cam, a truck cam, a stage 1 cam, nitrous cam, whatever. It all works. And actually what happens is the same thing happens with nitrous. If you take your motor, whatever motor it is, I don't care what it is, and you add nitrous to it and you add a given amount of nitrous flow to it, it's going to add a given amount of power. There aren't motors that respond better to the nitrous than others. If you add 100 horsepower with a nitrous, you're going to get 100 horsepower. The times when you won't get 100 horsepower is when you didn't have enough flow to actually get 100 horsepower and it wasn't delivering that. Or if you were trying to add 100 horsepower to an NA motor that only made 30 horsepower and it couldn't process the extra power offered by the nitrous. It isn't able to do that. But if you add 100 shot with that jetting, and essentially it's a flow rate, because what you're doing is providing a given number of oxygen molecules, and if you provide it with the requisite amount of fuel that it needs to burn those oxygen molecules, to utilize that, it's going to make that power. It's going to do that on a 4.8, a 5.3, a Hemi, a Magnum, a small block Chevy, whatever it is, it's going to do that. The one thing I can say as we go back to our discussion on the boost leaking out, it doesn't do that on a turbo application because the turbo has higher back pressure than it has boost pressure almost all the time. Where that doesn't occur and where it would be much more likely for you to bleed boost out would be on a supercharged combination, because a supercharged combination only has boost on one side of it. It only has positive pressure on the induction side. So therefore, and very little pressure, back pressure in the exhaust. If you have an NA combination or even a supercharged combination, you're not going to have very much back pressure. It's going to be measured in inches and not PSI. It's almost nothing. Unless you were to really, really restrict it for some reason with, the banana and the tailpipe trick, which you're not going to do. So there would be a situation or an argument that you could have, a technical discussion, that boost with both the valves open would want to flow out one and, in one and out the other because there's less pressure there. Again, with the speed of things that are happening as fast as they're happening, it's really hard for that to actually transpire and for you to lose boost. It's not impossible and it can happen. And you can see that a little bit and that does happen. But what happens when you have a supercharger and you have a naturally aspirated combination and you add boost to it, you still add boost to it. The thing that happens with superchargers, though, is that, and especially with a roots blower, typically when you put a roots blower on in place of some other manifold, you've changed the manifold. So then you've changed the shape of the power curve just because of the change in manifold. And then you have the blower on top of that. Centrifugal blowers are a little bit different than that, because normally you retain the factory manifold, let's say if that's the one that you were running naturally aspirated. But then a centrifugal has a rising boost curve. So it's going to provide the gains based on a rising boost curve. It's not going to have the same gain down low than it does up at the top. So it will artificially change the shape of the curve only because it has a rising boost curve. And what we found is, again, in the 99, or you could say 95, I guess, % range of the people that are trying this, if you have a good naturally aspirated combination with a good naturally aspirated camshaft and you add boost to it, it's going to work. I know that a lot of the factory stuff, guys, it was real popular, and I think probably less so now that we've done a lot of videos on it, but it's very popular for guys to use the factory LSA or LS9 and even LS7, which does exactly the same thing, those factory LS camshafts, because the LS9 and the LSA were blower cams. Well, they were actually They were blower cams. They were positive displacement blower cams, but they were also factory positive displacement blower cams. So they had not just blower duty in mind for the camshaft. They designed the cams to do other things. The OEMs have a lot of different goals, a list of goals that they have, the things that they have to achieve with that design. And power is not one of them. I mean, power is a minor thing. That's easy for them to make whatever power it is that they're trying to make. They're very sharp people. But along with that, they also have to have, you know, longevity of the part, expense, valve train stability. The springs have to last a long time. You know, it has to have a lot of things that go into there. They have to try to eliminate warranties and all. And so there's a lot of things that go into that design. The LS9 camshaft, traditionally, if you take a look at the videos I have up where we ran all the factory camshafts NA on a 5.3, you'll see exactly what it does. It's very soft down low. It has a really wide LSA, which is kind of typical of that. It has a big spread intake to the exhaust. The other thing that the OEMs were trying to do with that camshaft is they needed to make sure that it had a just like whisper smooth, billiard table smooth idle quality. So they did everything that they could to, you know, make sure that they checked all of those boxes with it. And again, it does make good power. As you saw, it is one of the most powerful factory cams on the big end. And which is what that cam is designed for, because the positive displacement blower on an LS9 is going to make all of the low speed and mid-range power that they can use. And so they tailor the camshaft on that particular application to enhance power production up high. The problem with guys trying to run that camshaft on a turbo application, especially on a turbo 5.3 or 4.8, which would be way more common from the wrecking yards and way more common for people to use as swap motors, putting that cam in it, the nice thing is it's cheap, but you have to change a lot of things to run that in the Gen 3 motor. But it's also going to be very soft on spool. I mean, it's not going to, it's so lazy downstairs that it's not going to come up very hard. And you know, you can cure those things a little bit with gearing and stall speed on the converter and stuff. But even still, there are much better choices for that. But that's a perfect example of what happens when we're tailoring a camshaft to do something. I've run lots of camshaft tests comparing that LS9 to other cams. I did that NA. And as we know, when you do that NA, you know what's going to happen when you add boost to that equation, because boost is just going to add what it adds to each one of those things. So what I would like people to do is when they're asking questions about these camshafts and the dreaded overlap and all that stuff, is stop thinking about camshafts in terms of you know, an NA cam or blower cam, turbo cam, nitrous cam, and just start thinking about it as a cam. Like, what power curve do I want my motor to look like? If I'm going to run a 5.3 and I'm going to run the truck intake, I'm going to run the 706 heads with valve springs, and I want to put a cam in it, put the cam in it. Forget about that it's going to be a turbo. Forget about that's going to be a blower. Forget about it that it's going to be nitrous. Put the cam in it that's going to give you the power curve that you want. Do you want something that has a near stock idle quality that maybe gains 20 or 30 or 40 extra horsepower at the top so that it's more than stock, but it still drives well? You can get that camshaft. Do you want something that's going to give you 70 or 80 or 90 horsepower on the top and you're willing to trade off the bottom end? There's a camshaft that will do that. Whatever that is, whatever you've done to the naturally aspirated power curve, that then is going to be your curve when you add boost to it. So that's the thing to think about. What is it you want? And the thing that, and really what started this whole conversation is that here's something to think about when you add the turbo. So a lot of guys, and I went through this comment with somebody today, and they were talking about putting this giant size camshaft in their LS motor. And I'm like, okay, good. And I thought that we must have been talking about an NA motor, because that would really be the only reason to put this giant size camshaft in it. The one that they were suggesting was not going to fit anyway. It wouldn't fit factory available piston to valve clearance. And I brought that up to them, but it's not going to work very well, or it isn't necessary for a turbo application, especially for the turbo that they were talking about using. They were going to put something small like a GT45 on it. And I'm like, well, you don't need, if you have a 5.3, you don't need a camshaft that's 240 degrees on the intake at 50. with the GT45 turbo, because it's just not going to be a good combination. The GT45 turbo is a 700 to 750 horsepower turbo. That's what it's going to do. So why not worry about the big end with that big camshaft, and it's going to destroy all the drivability and the turbo response. Just put a camshaft in it that's going to make the motor do what you want it to do. And then the nice thing about having the turbo is you have all of that extra power because you have boost that you didn't have to try to get with the camshaft. And the whole discussion about this is why daily driver combinations work so well with boost. Because when you're building a daily driver, one of the things I'm doing in this video is and these are all small block carbureted combinations, Ford, Chevy, and Dodge, but they all have fairly small camshafts, 206 to 212 degrees on the intake side. And that's fairly small. And especially when you're talking about 360 inches on the Dodge side, that's a fairly small camshaft. That's fairly mild. So what will happen is, because you have that mild camshaft, it's going to offer good torque production. It's going to offer good drivability, good idle quality, all of that stuff. And then if you were to add boost on top of that, all of a sudden you have this mega yards of like torque production because of the boost, and you have good drivability. That's why these kind of daily drivers and I've done videos on combinations with stock cams where you can make 600 horsepower with stock cams, or smaller, milder cams that would be more daily driver oriented, because guys want to have a camshaft in their car. And a lot of guys want to have a cam that's like I said, more of a daily driver cam. The torque cam from BTR or other people, the truck cams from everybody sells truck cams. All of those small cams work very well, and they work very well for your average daily driver. And then when you add boost to that, guess what? They still work really well. And you can have all the power that you want. And like I said, we've said this many times, with a 750 horsepower turbo, you're going to make 750 horsepower. With a 1,000 horsepower turbo, you're going to make 1,000 horsepower. And you can do that with these small cams that would be more conducive to like daily driver applications. So it's really good stuff. And it's important, like I said, for people to understand that on the turbo combinations, the boost does not bleed out. If anything, it's going to go the other way. And actually, probably what is more likely to happen is, if there's pressure on the hot side and pressure on the cold side, they're just going to go into the area where there's less pressure. But like I said, this stuff is happening so fast, and you have so many other pressure waves and things going on. That's why that all of this works. When you look at the speeds of these things that are happening and you start doing the math, I was amazed that an internal combustion engine even works when you start thinking about how many times it happens per second and how much these things weigh. And it's amazing that all of this stuff works. But lucky for you guys, there are guys out there doing lots and lots of testing and telling you, hey, look, when you run this camshaft, this is what happens. And that's the kind of data that you want to see. And that's how you should be making your decision. Don't let somebody talk you into, oh, these magic valve events are going to determine everything that happens. Ask them if they've tested it. Ask them if they tested it against like 8 or 10 other ones. And then that way they can tell you, no, I haven't really. I just think that this will work. And the lucky thing for you is, whatever they're suggesting, as long as it fits within the factory available piston to valve clearance, it's probably going to work. But so would a lot of other things. So that's something to think about. So let's get to our questions and see what you guys got going on. XC. So you're saying that a 229, 240, 629, 600, 115 plus 3 is too much for a daily driver cam on a 6-liter with a 745. I don't think a 229 is too much. The 629 lift actually worries me, because you don't need anywhere near that much lift. And what happens is, especially with a 229 intake duration and the 629 lift, you're going to have, I think that lobe might be bordering on the unstable range. And so I would worry about valve train longevity with that, because you don't need that much lift I would rather see the thing at 600 or 590, because you don't need that, especially if you have a turbo. There's no reason to have that much lift. The rest of the stuff will work fine. It doesn't need to have that big a split, a 229, 240. But again, that will work. We've run the 227, 243 with very good results. and a 76, 75 on a 6-liter should work. Maybe a little bit bigger on the hot side, but that it should certainly make boost and make power though. 1993 Cobra, the old Incon twin turbo systems were the best, full boost at 2,500 RPM. And that's the way that the when you look at a factory turbo system, that's what they want. They want immediate boost response because they want the small turbo motor to feel like a big motor, because that's what we as Americans really want, especially even more so than European drivers. A Texas Speed 212, 218, that's kind of the camshaft basically that I used in all three of the examples of the daily driver thing that I'm doing. ProCharge Mopar, hit that like button. That's what we like. Come on, guys. We got 283 and 97. You guys got to get them likes in there, man. Yeah, 629 is hard on the valve springs and on the street and stuff. That's why, you know, everyone wants to see big lift stuff, especially if you're used to big block stuff, which is going to be 700, 800 or even more than that. And you think like, oh, 650 lift on a big block is kind of tame. And that I look at that 300 BR14 camshaft I use so much, it's only like 652 lift, which is very small. But for an LS, you know, you can make a bajillion horsepower with a 600 lift cam. Tyrell, when students are present, the teacher will teach. New sub. Great. Good to have you. Yeah, there's and that's the thing. I keep trying to tell people how much more and actually the two things go together. You will enjoy a turbo that's more responsive a lot more often than you will a turbo that has like this mega charge on the big end, you know, unless you're going drag racing and you want to run 180, 190 miles an hour in the quarter, then you're going to have that big end. But driving around, you'll want something that's like a lot more responsive. And that's the same thing with camshafts. You're going to enjoy the benefits of a milder camshaft and the torque production a lot more than you are going to enjoy what you get from the bigger camshafts out at 7,000 or 7,500 RPM, because you spend a lot more of your time at 3,000 and 3,500. You know, most of us do. And the stage thing for guys is because they were brought up on the Edelbrock tier program where it's you know, performer RPM and Victor Jr., the 3 kind of tier deal, and it's just telling them that one is more than the other, because the reality is, and I try to have this conversation with guys that are cam designers and manufacturers, and it's something that they don't understand from a marketing standpoint. If you put 1,000 people in a room and start talking to them about valve events, you're going to have 5 or 10 people that understand what you're talking about, because people don't understand valve events. Most people don't understand what lift is or duration or lobe separation angle. And you have to teach people about those things before you can start teaching them about valve events. You can say, oh, this one opens at this point and this one closes at this point, but people cannot visualize that unless they have the basics down. And again, 99% of the people out there are not there. They're not at that level where, even if they've talked to 10 cam manufacturers and they've all told them, look, this one opens at 61 degrees or whatever, they can start saying, okay, yeah, at 61 degrees, I understand that 60 would be less than that and 62 would be more than that. But they have no idea what that is. They don't know why that's good or bad, or what happens with it in relation to other opening and closing events. They don't have a way of understanding that. And that's not bad on them. It's just that there's no reason for you to do that. If you're a guy and you've got a truck and you're putting a truck cam in it, you don't have to understand the valve events. There's no reason for anybody to even be talking to you about valve events if you're buying a truck cam and putting a truck cam in your truck. To do that is to take the chance on losing that customer, because they're just going to gray out. They're not going to understand what you're talking about, and they don't need to. What they need to understand is This is a truck cam. It's mild. It only has this much more duration than a stock cam. It's going to idle good. It's going to be easy on parts. It's going to last forever, and it's going to make lots of power, bro. That's what they want. They don't want valve events. And I've gone over this many, many times with lots of people, and they still want to do the valve event thing for all of our customers. We're going to educate all of our customers. You're not going to. Will you do a low deck Mopar 512 with turbos? I would kind of like to do a 400 based one, but I probably will end up doing a 440. Did you ever hear about the Incon? Yeah, I'm familiar with the Incon stuff. As a matter of fact, Brian Tooley had an Incon system, I think, and I don't think he ever put it on there. Are the thumper style cams good? They're good for having that cammy sound, which is what guys want. They also make fairly decent power because they have a big intake to exhaust duration split, which tends to enhance power higher up in the RPM range. But they weren't designed to be performance cams. Stan, I have a 468 big block, 8-to-1 with going to use it with an 871, but drivability rather than twin turbo. What size turbos do you think? Will it be okay at 8-to-1? 8-to-1's fine, and a 990 is going to be fairly easy. I don't know what car it's going in, but 2 turbos on a 468 can make a bajillion horsepower. We put 2, even if you run 2 of those little GT45s, that's still going to make 1,200 on a big block without any problem, and could probably make more than that if you want to do it cheaply. If you want to step up and put an S475 or even something slightly smaller than that, because that'd be 2,000 horsepower with a turbo, and you're not going to need that to run 990. It will do that, and I think that you're going to need to retune it. So I don't know. I think when we were doing stuff on the Yaris, I remember we put an AEM on the Yaris. 500 wheel horsepower goal, 5.3 Gen 3 single turbo. The 500 wheel horsepower is right in the range of that GT45, so that's right in the wheelhouse. That's be perfect for a 5.3. Have you ever tested the 2-liter double overcab engines that came in the 90s Eagle Talons and Eclipses? Yeah, those are the 4Gs, right? Yeah, I've done some chassis dyno stuff, but not on the engine dyno. There's a stage 3 crossover to a 3/4 race cam. That's what the 3 stands for, right? And it's right in between the 3 and the 4. Yeah, it's a 4/4 race cam. The interesting thing is if you take a look at, and this is something I was thinking about while I was going over all of this information on the different, on these milder cams, is if you take a look in the Comp Cams catalog, they tell you, okay, this cam is good for this RPM range, except that they haven't listed as a small block Chevy cam. Well, small block Chevys range from, they varied by more than 100 cubic inches, 262 to 400 cubic inches. So that camshaft will not run effectively in the same RPM on all of those motors. And it's not even going to run the same RPM if you select the average one that, let's say that the most typical one would be a 350 in the case of a small block Chevy. It's not even going to run in the same operating range on a 350, depending on how you deck out the 350. If the 350 is done with a set of airflow research heads and a single plane intake manifold and a 950 carburetor, and it's 12-to-1, and you put some camshaft in it that says, oh, it's good to 6,000 RPM. It's not going to be. It's going to rev higher than that because it has lots of cylinder head on it, has lots of intake manifold on it. Conversely, if that 350 has stock A82 heads, it's got 8-to-1 compression, it's got a quadrajet cast iron intake manifold and a small quadrajet on it, or even worse, a 2-barrel, it's not going to run the same RPM as listed in the catalog. And so people can't go by what it says there because that's not really enough information. And turbos are kind of the same way. a GT45 is going to react differently on a 2-liter or 1.5 liter than it is on a 454. So you have to take into consideration the thing that you're putting on. It's very important. Add Bruce to everything. Sloppy stage 1, Elgin. I think the sloppy stage 1 would be my choice over sloppy stage 2 on most applications. Going to daily drive a 6-liter with a stage 2 brand to a turbo cam spring upgrade, trunnion upgrade, what's an 832 head? Am I missing out on one of the heads that I should know about for the LS? I'd like to break the stock cam turbo LS record. So what record is that, Mike? I have not done the AC evaporator thing. Dodge does that from the factory, but I've never tried it. Yeah, I have done 4G63 stuff. And I raced against the Archer brothers in World Challenge, and their cars were really sporty. No more 400M stuff, just what's up there right now. No spinning. This is a good question because this is the reason I did a lot of the videos that I did. I've been running LS3 type split cam. So he's running a rec port cam on a cathedral port head on 243 heads. Does the exhaust duration mean as much on power curve as intake? If you take a look at the video that I have up where I ran a cathedral port cam and a rec port cam on a cathedral port head combination and a rec port head combination, you'll see exactly what happens. The 259 comp cam and the 269 comp cam, just a big change in exhaust duration effectively, does the same thing regardless of what cylinder head you have on it. The extra exhaust duration makes more power on the top, makes a little less down low, but actually in the middle, it made exactly the same power on both heads. Relatively speaking, one of the rec port head, the motor with either cam made more power than it did with the cathedral port heads because rec port heads, factory rec port heads make more power than factory cathedral port heads do. Would a TSP truck cam stage 3 and long tube headers be good for towing and power on a 5.3? They will not be good for towing. A stage 3, in my opinion, for a 5.3 is too big. I would go with a stage 1 or maybe a stage 2. That's the problem with everybody is they think that, oh, a stage 1, because a 2 exists, I have to go with at least a 2. And because a 3 and 4 exist, those are more and those are better. So I have to go with those. And that's not actually the case. Cole, your uncle has a twin turbo AC Cobra, not a kit car. He custom built the chassis. That's very cool. Let's see. XC, on the subject of daily driver turbos, do journal bearing turbos like the PTE 7675 Precision Sportsman last, or do you need a ball bearing? In all the turbos I've ever run, I've never had a turbo bearing go bad. So I have not put 1,000,000 miles on these things and driven them around and done that. But I've never had them go bad. So I don't necessarily know that a ball bearing is going to last longer than a journal bearing is. I think most people think that the ball bearing improves like spool response like it does with a lighter wheel and stuff. In my opinion, that the spool rate of the turbo has less to do with the weight of the wheel than it does to the exhaust energy that you're putting to the turbine, which is a function of the torque production and size and torque production of the motor. But that's a discussion I can have with somebody at a later date. But I don't think that you need to have a ball bearing. But when you're listing all the cool things that you have, dual ball bearing turbo and all the yada yada stuff. Burning tires, 280, 286, 625, 625, 112, and a 60 with twin GT45s. If the 280 and 286, I'm hoping are advertised numbers and not at 50 numbers, because otherwise those are really big camshafts. Brian, I'm building the same. And I'm going with an S480 on my 6-liter at less than... An S480 is good size for a 6-liter. I thought if you put 10 people in the room and ask them about valve vents, you get 15 different opinions, at least, especially if they were all cam designers. So a good cam for my 340 would be 114, 292, 509. So 114 is the LSA, 292 is the advertised duration, 509 is the lift. 292 is a fairly good size cam if it's an advertised number. I don't know what the 50 number is. I'd be more concerned with that, or I'd like to know what that is. But that cam is going to be pretty healthy for a 340. I'm hoping that you have good heads with it and a good intake manifold. We put a BTR cam 629 in our ZL1 stroker. Did it work good? And by the way, when you're talking to somebody about camshafts, give them the duration at 50 numbers, and then give them the lift. The lift has much less to do with the performance than the duration numbers do. They're all important because a 500 lift cam is probably not going to make as much power as a 600 lift cam, but a 500 lift cam versus a 600 lift cam doesn't tell you nearly enough about the cam to decide how big the camshaft is, because it could be a 600 lift cam but only have 200 degrees of duration. That would be a fairly aggressive ramp rate, but you could have that, and so the cam would still be fairly mild even though it has 600 lift. How would a Gen 3 VS7875 1.25 do on a low compression 412? It would be fine. It's probably still going to be ultimately exhaust limited unless the 412 is really, really mild. On a turbo engine, is a smaller head better for daily drivability versus a larger flowing cam? Why would those be the two choices that you would have? A good flowing head will never hurt you, even if it's big. Like an LS3 head flows more and makes more power than a cathedral port head. It's just a down low. Well, I guess down low it could soften things up a bit. I would rather go with a better head and the smaller camshaft would be the combination I would like. Ohio's in the house. Curious of your opinion on results of my daily driver 89 IROC. Nice. Gen 3 6-liter with twin 6 racing GT35s. I believe they're 60 at 65s. Is it a GT35 82? That would be their common one, but it could be a 68 65, and twins on that would be fine. Mitten, I ran a tiny S366, which is a good turbo, on my bone stock L8353. That's going to be really responsive and then ultimately a little bit of probably a lot of back pressure. 440 wheel horsepower. That's good. 470 foot-pounds. I know cam's the old school way. 292 is a big cam. 292, if we're talking about big blocks, 292 would be the duration at 50, usually on the exhaust, but the daily driver truck stuff, I've run lots of dyno stuff starting at 2,000, but that's about as low as we would go because you're never at wide open throttle at 1,000 RPM or even 1,500 RPM. So actually, it would be much better for me to do part throttle stuff starting at lower engine speeds than it would be to do wide open throttle stuff down there. I do like the sound of a quadrajet, which I need to do the air cleaner flip lid on the engine dyno. Richard, what are your thoughts on a turbo Gen 1 small block with a factory casting? You should do it. It will work just fine. $1991 5-liter HO cam, 266, 276. Yeah, and that's a fairly mild cam. Most of the factory stuff is going to be in the they're normally in the 190 range. Like a 5-liter LM7 cam is like a 190, 191. And you'll find a lot of stuff in that 190 range. Some of the stuff is really small. It's in the 180s, and probably even 170s on some small displacement, especially guys that were doing small displacement turbo combinations might be down in the 170s, but the 180, 190 range, and going into, like, if you look at some of the LS stuff, they went into the 200s. Like the LS9 is a 211, 230, I think, something like that. The old school blocks do not break at 500 horsepower unless they're aftermarket. That's we've run lots more power than that. We've run 4-digit stuff on factory 4-bolt Chevy blocks. Yeah, and Tim is saying that now too. I think he's trying to copy me. An 823 head would make more sense. Yes, I'm familiar with that one. Do you think I can make 900 horsepower in a 460? Yes, you can. I did one that made over 900, but it was a 557, so it was a stroker version. But it takes a lot of cylinder head to do that if you're doing it naturally aspirated. But if you're doing it with turbos, it's very easy. William, would a twin turbo CX racing kit be good for a 302? The turbos themselves all work. The thing that the fitment on some of that stuff is a little questionable, but the Trickflow 11R heads, very, very good. Have you ever used diesel turbos on gas engines? I haven't run the Power Stroke Garrett, but we've run lots of whole set stuff back in the day, and they work just fine. They're turbos. They spin and make boost, and fill it full of boostedy goodness. 258, 266 advertised duration is a pretty small cam. $1951 one-ton dually with a stock 5.9 Magnum running 17 pounds. That's a lot. Rob, do you know what the stock cams are on that V12 if it's a 4-cam motor? Because it might be that thing already runs fairly well. Like if maybe it already makes peak power at 6,000 RPM, so maybe it has enough cam timing already to do that. The other thing I would look at, is that a Jaguar? What is it? A 4-cam V12? Is it a Ferrari? Just tell me what it is. And then I would look at the intake manifold also, because that's going to help you determine what the effective RPM range is. But 7 to 10 pounds, even with a stock cam, is going to work really well. For smaller displacement engines, would you recommend twin turbos, compound, or super turbo combination for responsiveness? It depends on what you're trying to do, and it depends on what exact motor you're trying to do, and then what power level you're trying to get to. So if you need to get from a 100 horsepower small displacement motor and you want to make 1,000, you're going to have to get really creative about what you're doing. You might have to do compounds or sequentials or something. So it depends on if you can get from where you are to where you need to be. The thing that I like to do, and what we did with the motor on the Bonneville Civic, is, first of all, it was almost 2 liters because that was the limit of the displacement that we could run in the class that we were running in. But we did everything we can to make the motor really responsive. So we wanted to get it to make as much naturally aspirated power as we could. So it was a 10-to-1 motor, which is enough. It had ported heads. It had stage 2 cams in it, 2s or 2.5s or something thereabouts. We tried different intake manifolds on it. It worked well with the ported P30 that we had on it. It also worked well with the Type R. For Bonneville, we didn't care nearly as much about response rate on that combination because I couldn't go full throttle in that car until the very top of 4th gear, which was 160 or so miles an hour. So we didn't care about boost response. It didn't need to have boost right now. It needed to have boost in VTEC, and then above that up to 8,500 or so, which is what we shifted at from fourth to fifth. And then in fifth, we just let it run out and go as fast as it would go. Have you maxed out a GT45 on a 6-liter? It's going to be less than it is on a 4.3 or a 5.8. It's going to be somewhere in the low 700 range. The Brodick Headhunters. I don't remember running the Headhunters. I know that I ran some of the. Did they make a Dragon Slayer or something head? I think that they did. I think that those might have been the ones that we ran. What size cam would be best for towing on a 360? If it's a 360 Magnum, I think you need to look at something that's less than 212 degrees at 50, unless you have a fairly tight LSA, because then that's going to help with the low speed power. But we ran that 212, 218 camshaft, and I think it lost a little bit down low compared to the factory cam. So I think I would like to see something that's less than that, like a 206, 212 or a 208, 214 or something, and then something that's not 112 or 114 degree LSA, something that's 110. And as you go milder in the camshaft, because you're going tighter on the LSA, you're going to lose drivability. But as you go milder in the camshaft, you kind of start bringing that back. XC chop cams are usually low RPM cams that produce more low end torque. A low end torque cam makes for a very good turbo cam. And as I just discussed at the beginning of this, you can't blow the exhaust. You can't blow the boost out the exhaust. It can't. It has lots of back pressure on that side. So it can't go from low pressure to high pressure. It actually would go the other way. What do you get when you add a 4-inch exhaust on a stock K24 BorgWarner S366 versus a 3-inch exhaust? You should pick up power. Unless the 3-inch exhaust is the 3-inch exhaust all the way back. I know that when we did the Civic, we definitely picked up power going to a bigger exhaust on the Civic. I don't know that we ever ran a 4-inch though. Let's see, what size was that coming out of there? I think we ran 3.5 on the Civic, and we even did oval pipe because we were trying to get it up off of the ground. I would suspect that you'd pick up a little bit, but on a if I don't know what the K24 is in, but just an easy test for a chassis dyno is to build an exhaust that just like take the hood off and just build an exhaust. Normally those are V bands. Build an exhaust that just goes straight up and see what happens. So if you don't gain anything from a really short open exhaust like that, then it's not worth building the exhaust under the car, but it's a good way to test it and find out. Burning tires, 232, 238, F50, 625, 112. So did I miss what that was doing, what you were doing with that? That's a good size cam, and it should fit factory piston to valve clearance with the 232 on a 112. Yeah, 258 advertised duration is going to be too small. That's like, I think that's less than stock. Do the lower exhaust back pressure to compressor pressure ratio turbines work well on the street, or are these more for max RPM? The turbo itself doesn't do that. The turbo, what you put the turbo on determines that. So the turbo size, if you put a turbo on that has a really giant size exhaust, that can facilitate that. But usually the turbo, if you have, let's take our GT45. If we have our GT45 turbo and we run that on a K24, it's going to have very little back pressure, almost none. It's going to have low, it might have lower back pressure than it has boost pressure. If we run that same turbo, same configuration on a 454 Chevy, it's going to have twice as much or maybe 2.5 times as much back pressure as it has boost pressure. So the relationship between boost pressure and back pressure is a function of the power output of the NA motor relative to the size of the turbo. Better head and smaller camshaft. The Boss 302 is a really good example of that. Yeah. Would you be open to viewers donating engines for different Big Bang? What did you have in mind? What is the best recommended horsepower for an LM7 twin turbo for a daily? Take a look at the videos I have up on bone stock LM7s, and they're all going to be in the 500 to 600 horsepower range. But he's putting a 6-liter with cathedral heads on a early 2000s Camaro with a 4L80E. He's wanting to go BTR Stage 3. He doesn't need is that a turbo motor or is it an NA motor? If it's an NA motor, then yeah, you then put some camshaft in it. If it's a turbo motor, he doesn't need that much cam. And also ARC, the 882 does not have a very good chamber design. Global C6 Corvette stock 6.2 LS3 intake. I hope it has the stock intake still. Engine 7/8 headers, X pipe, exhaust, tune, good cam for autocross, drifting, drag strip. Sometimes daily driving. Which cam and springs for 500, 600 horsepower. The 500 horsepower part of it's doable. The 600 horsepower you're not going to do with a cam. But take a look at the videos that I have up. I've lots of 6.2 cam stuff up. But something like the Comp 54-469-11 or the Stage 4 Pro LS cam worked very well from the guys at Summit. That worked well also and makes a lot of power. Or you could go something smaller like a 227 intake duration camshaft on that is good, a little bit better maybe for daily driver. Do we have a troll here or something? I haven't seen it if that's the case. Aaron, when installing a turbo stock manifolds on a V8, is there going to be any drawback when using an 1 3/4 exhaust pipe? Well, what size is the exit out of the stock exhaust? If you're necking that down, you're going to hurt flow a little bit, but probably that's not going to make a big difference in power until you get up to the very top. Global, thank you very much. Ben, is a 650 left cam too big for a standard bore 350 with flat tops and 180 Brodex heads? The lift doesn't concern me, although normally that lift goes in line with lots and lots of duration. So you're trying to make a whole lot of power, probably not with a 180 Brodex head. So my guess is you don't need that much lift, that kind of camshaft with that particular cylinder head. Probably a better choice to put something milder in there. Jeff, 1989 stock bottom end 5-liter B303 and GT40Ps, unported 70mm turbo. Starts making boost at 1700. Nice. And again, you have an F-150 truck. So the heavier the vehicle, the more load you have, and then that'll get the turbo up and working. Yeah, I used the 882 heads on a lot of the videos that I did. That was kind of our stock head that we did for a lot of things. I think that's the head that they used on the L82, if I remember right. Burning tires. Okay, that's the cam that you're using in your twin GT45 6-liter. So 2 GT45s on a 6-liter is going to be a 12 or 1300 horsepower potential combination. So you could choose smaller turbos if you're running a lot less power than that. Like you could put twin GT35s on there and they'd be a lot more responsive. Also, a 232, 238 cam would be a cam that I would put in an NA 6-liter. It's not one that I would put in a turbo one because it could be more responsive if you put a milder camshaft in it. Turbo, a Gen 544. I have videos up of junkyard 454s with boost on them. So it just depends on what kind of power output you want. Is it important to balance hot side pressure with compressor side for longevity? No, it's not. I mean, if you look at factory stuff, it's not unusual for them to have 2-to-1 or more exhaust back pressure versus boost pressure. So that sort of relationship is fine. Did you ever find boosted versus stock ring gap specs for the 3800? I haven't. Well, we did take it apart. I just haven't taken the pistons out yet. I know you, let's see. This is a 2.5-liter question, so I got to answer that. I know you have the cheap GT45. Is there a cheap turbo that you would recommend for a 1990 2.5-liter Chrysler turbo? Yes, I would recommend something smaller, like if you want to make 500 horsepower, the GT35 would be good, or even something smaller than that. A GT3076 would probably be okay. Even something like a T28, depending on how much power you want to make. There's lots of T3, T4 hybrid stuff that would work. You just got to tell me how much power you want to do. If you're only wanting to see 500 horsepower on a turbo big block, that's really easy. In any S475 or S480 on a motor that big, and especially if it's a 454, you should at least put a camshaft in it. Yeah, burning tires, I would go something smaller than that. I would go with a 224, 232 kind of thing. But what you really need to do is go smaller on the turbos too. Yeah, see, Tim is telling you a GT28 also. – 236, 246. That's a lot of cam, but it won't fit in a stock piston to valve clearance application. More power. When that happens, we use a Kenny Bell booster pump. Boss 302 had to wind it to 8,500. I don't know why. I have a video up of the Boss 302, and it actually made very comparable torque to the DZ 302. Safe PSI for non-intercooled setup. I need more information to answer that. I'm curious if you ever ran coolant water through the heads and out the block, and what the temperature change was noticed with the cylinder heads. So you want to go through the heads first? Is that what you're saying? The GT45 is a 700 horsepower turbo, so a 302 would be really good for that. Are map sensor tunes better than MAF for turbo applications? I don't. Both of those can work well. I know we don't ever run, when I do the stuff on the engine dyno, we don't ever run a mass air meter unless it's like unless it was a factory one, and for whatever reason we're running the factory ECU like we had to do with the Coyotes and stuff. But normally we just do map based stuff. Boosted spark, they're the same thing, but yes. A 236 intake duration cam fits in an LS2. Does it have a really wide LSA? Positive displacement blowers on LS7. Yes, you can do that. Should find out by Friday what the BTR stage 4 does over BTR stage 3. What cam and manifold would you suggest for a 468 big block 8-to-1 with twin GT45s? Are you wanting to make all the power? Then you should run like I have one of the fuel injected Edelbrock tunnel rams, I think, and that probably would be a good application. Brian Tooley, truck stage 2 won't make 400 horsepower of the tire in a 5.3. Trying to think. I think it was only making like 420 or 430 to the flywheel. So no, I don't think it would do that. Even if you were starting with an L33 that was a flat top with 243 heads and a intake and stuff on there, I don't think it'll do that. Oh yeah, 250 wheel horsepower. There's lots of little turbos that will do that. Random, thank you very much. Let me see. How much boost can you run with a stock computer and no tune on a 3.5 liter inline 5 Vortec? You probably can't. You probably can't run any boost. You have to tune it because you're going to have to deliver more fuel and less timing. I don't think that the LS2 had valve notches from the factory. I thought it was just a flat top. What turbo size for my L92 stroker? 418, 225, 236, 112 heavy truck. Probably an S480 if you're going to do a single. Dan, I can't remember ever running stepped headers with a turbo setup. I haven't tried that. I really want to try long tube headers and see what I think we're going to get. I'm thinking that we would make more power on an application where the long tube headers make more power NA, but I also think we might get a response change. So I'd be interested to see. Random. Let me see. It doesn't matter which engines. I just like to see oddballs make noise. So anything, right? Anything we want to run. The 882s have fairly thin decks too, don't they? Good lumpy cam for a Vortec 350. No head. If it's a Vortec head, then it's going to have to be fairly low lift. So what you should do is do a low lift one, get something that has 220 degrees of duration on the intake side, and then a tight LSA, and they'll have all the lumpiness that you want. Tim, I've run one of those GT25s. I ran a real Garrett one. It might have even been a GT22 that I was trying on the Chevy, the inline or the 3-cylinder Chevy Sprint turbo motor. It was a small one. I need to go back and look. It was either a GT20 or a GT22. The heads do flow well on the LSA engine, and you don't need it for for the kind of power level I think that you were talking about. The CX Racing intercoolers, the ones that we've used, like the dual core that we use on all the Big Bang motors, is actually pretty good. I'd like something different and better and bigger than that, because I think when we're talking about 1,500 horsepower, there deserves to be more flow. But it's worked pretty well. The micro squirt stuff works good, and the mega squirt that we had on the 4200 worked really good too. Porting the supercharger on the ZL1 will help, and especially if you're at the flow limit of, like, if you've done everything else, if you've done the camshaft and ported heads and you have the motor and the headers and all that, and now you're at a point and you're spinning the blower as fast as it will go, porting the blower now will help. If you aren't at the limit of all those things, then the gains will be less. For monsters here, what's a good setup on an EFI 300 inline 6? I think that Holley now has a 2-barrel EFI throttle body for that inline 6-cylinder, I think. Stan, yes, I would always recommend an intercooler on any turbo application. And if you want a good camshaft for that, take a look at that 300 BR14 from Comp Cams. It's a 255, 262. It's a solid roller, but it's actually for a blower combination. But we've run it with turbos and NA and nitrous and everything else, because every cam, as they say, is a turbo cam, and it works very well. It's like 650 lift. And it's a good, we've made 13 or 1400 with that cam in a 540. So you can make good power with that camshaft. 06 Silverado, 5.3, single turbo or twin turbo for daily driving. A single fits just fine. The 5-liter Mustang engines are really good. I like them. Javier, ideal turbo size for an LQ4. So I got one more question that I got to get going. Ideal turbo size for an LQ4 408 stroker. It depends on, again, your power output. Do you want a 1,000 horsepower 408 or do you want a 2,000 horsepower 408? It's going to make a big difference on what the power level that you want. So we got one more question. Let's see. Okay, Tim, you get the last question. What's a good size turbo for twin setup on the Gen 1 Coyote to make between 600 and 800? Again, that's a 200 horsepower range. That's a lot. But twin GT 3076s or twin GT 3582s, which are going to do like 1,000 horsepower, give you a little bit of room to grow. The other ones will probably be a little bit, the 3076s will be a little bit more responsive, but certainly do the 800 number if that's what you want it to be. Those will definitely do that and be fairly responsive, and they're fairly inexpensive. There's lots of them out there. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you all tomorrow. Do 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 do.